So I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Minda Berbeco, who's here, our incredible intern, Rachel Connolly, Frank Niepold, who's also here, Kristen Poppleton, Emily Cloyd, Tamara Ledley, and others who are not listed here. Scott Carley's in the audience. I don't know if Mona Bell is here, but Scott and Mona did a lot of the work on our coastal and ocean chapters. But I'm here to tell you a little bit about, oops, I see, okay, here we go. Technical difficulties here. I'm here to tell you about the learning pathways that we developed to augment and supplement the National Climate Assessment. And before I get into the nitty-gritty of what's actually in these learning pathways and how we put them together, just a little bit of background about the National Center for Science Education, since some of you may not be familiar with it. We have been around for actually over 30 years, based here in the Bay Area. And historically, we've been focused on defending the teaching of evolution in public schools. Several years ago, I came out here 3 years ago from the University of Colorado to help start a program focused on defending the teaching of climate change. And we've taken a very broad approach to trying to make sure that climate change is taught and taught well, and to get scientists and other boosters of science education to support these efforts. We are also involved with putting together a national survey with Eric Plutzer of Penn State on whether and where secondary science teachers are teaching climate change. This survey is out in the field right now, and I had hoped to be able to report some early findings, but it should give us a better sense of where climate change is being taught in the curriculum, if at all, how it's being taught, and whether or not teachers are sometimes teaching it as controversy, which we feel is a very counterproductive approach. I'm also a proud member of the Science League of America, which is our blog, and we have an informal motto of keeping good science in and bad science out of the classroom. So check out ncse.com/blog if you'd like to know more about the Science League of America. I also had the privilege of attending the launch of the National Climate Assessment back in May, and about 2 minutes and 30 seconds of my 15 minutes of fame are on C-SPAN for posterity, or as long as C-SPAN continues to exist. And I think the rest of my 15 minutes will be deducted from my talk here today. So before I start, I'd like to begin with two large footnotes to kind of help set the stage about the conundrum that we face in climate education. And one is that there is no mandate at the national level for people to be learning about climate education, at least directly. The Global Change Research Act of 1990 mandates the National Climate Assessment every 4 years. The USGCRP program was developed out of that act from 1990. Education was not mentioned, and it's only recently that USGCRP added education as one of their strategic priorities, which is good, but it's a recent development. Internationally, the UN Framework for Climate Change, which was ratified over 20 years ago by the nations of the world, actually does include some very strong language about the importance of education, training, and public awareness. And over the past 20-something years, very little has been done around these efforts by and large. Certain countries have done a little bit here and there. There's been really no strong coordinated effort. And the Doha meeting, the Doha work program from 2012, in order to kind of reboot and revitalize the Article 6 framework, had suggested that each nation establish focal points, people who can help lead the development of a national strategy for climate education, training, and public awareness. The new Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House initiative, Climate Education and Literacy Initiative, I will talk more about in a minute, but that may be a strategy that we can help fold into a national strategy. This talk talks mostly about education, but I did want to communicate the idea that education, communications, and outreach are all connected. They're all kind of part of a continuum, and there's different ways of slicing and dicing and defining what these terms mean. But to me, education is really kind of long-term understanding through literacy and pedagogical development. Communications is shorter term, often in the form of a report, a press release, something like that. And outreach is shorter, sweeter. It could be a tweet, it could be a Facebook posting, or something along those lines. And of course, there's a lot of overlap. But these are different skill sets, often different agendas behind them. And this is a Venn diagram that I put together for another conference. I hope, is Richard Ellie in the room? Because he saw this slide once and almost had a heart attack because he wasn't keen on the way I defined outreach. But as I say, there's different ways of defining these terms, and this is just a first attempt to parse out the difference of how education, communications, and outreach are different skill sets, but ultimately they do overlap, and they can really be very synergistic together. So a little bit of a reality check in terms of climate education as it relates to the National Climate Assessment. Most Americans fail basic climate and energy literacy. As of a couple of years ago, Tony Leisowitz at Yale conducted a study of teens and adults and found that fewer than 1 in 5 teens in this country feel like they've learned a lot about climate change in school. Most of them would like to learn more, but they're just not learning it in school. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. That's a whole nother talk that I could give. In fact, I'm giving one on Wednesday if you want to hear more about that. But this comes out of that same survey from a few years back. And the key thing to keep in mind is the red and the orange mean that the people failed, and that the blue mean that they passed barely. I mean, the dark blue is they got an A, basically. So the point of this is that the people who are disengaged and dismissive of climate change basically don't know much about climate change if you really drill into their understanding. And those who are alarmed and concerned know more. So there's more research that's been done lately to kind of back up on that. But in any event, we have a lot of work to do in this country because we don't have a national strategy and we don't have a national curriculum that would allow all students to learn about climate change. So when you put up a map like this from the National Climate Assessment of the RCP, the Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5, how many of you understand what the 8.5 stands for? Essentially watts per meter squared, right? And that's something that's often assumed that people understand that that's watts per meter squared we're talking about. But by the way, the degrees in temperature here are in Fahrenheit for Americans. When we talk about 2 degrees of warming, in Americans, well, 2 degrees, it doesn't sound so much, but that's, of course, in centigrade. But the RCP, Representative Concentration Pathways, the 8.5 model doesn't stop at 2100. It keeps on going up to 12 watts per meter squared by 2200 from this data from the Potsdam Institute. So in any event, there's more to the story beyond 2100, and we're certainly on the trajectory right now towards that move from less than 3 watts per meter squared of forcing since the Industrial Revolution started to 8.5 by the end of the century. And there's a lot that can be said about doubt, denial, and despair. There's the literal denial that it's not happening or it's just natural cycles. There's also the idea that maybe there's nothing that we can do about it, denial of responsibility. And to me, one of the most painful sorts of denial is denying that education is important, that it takes too long or it's just not, it's not going to cut the muster. The 2.6 scenario, which is essentially holding steady of where we are today in terms of how much we've tweaked the climate system, is something that we could be able to manage and adapt to much more easily. But to achieve this scenario, we would have to transform everything, including our education system. So again, the National Climate Assessment required by Congress, we've had 3 of them. the first one in 2000, and I know there was a town hall meeting here about the very first one that was fewer, it might have been in this room, in fact, and there were only a handful of people in there, as I remember. But in any event, all these federal agencies have been involved with developing the assessment, and also a cast of many hundreds of experts, including I know some of you in this room were actively involved in putting the report together. So we thought about what can we do, since education is not a part of this report, what can we do to add value to it? And we started an education affinity group in 2013, and one of our goals was to work with a number of organizations like the CLEAN Network, the Climate Literacy, Energy, and Awareness Network, to add value to the National Climate Assessment. And we were not able to get access to the assessment before it actually came out. We had some sense of what was going to be in there, but our goal was to make the assessment more accessible and meaningful to teachers. So we had no external funding for this, and it was basically out of the goodness of our hearts and through crowdsourcing that we were able to pull this off. We initially used the metaphor of looking for buried treasure because we knew that the climate assessment just is full of great images and information, and so we have evolved that idea of a treasure hunt into the idea of learning pathways, but the idea is the same, that there's just real gems in here that we need to call out and help them make the National Climate Assessment really come alive for educators and learners. The website was put together with a mobile-first approach, meaning that it works really well on cellular devices, and one of the things that we were excited about is the fact that mobile learning through cell phones and tablets and so forth is really revolutionizing how and where people learn. There's all these chapters, and we only focused on the ones that were regionally focused because we didn't have the money to really do this for all of the chapters, although each of the chapters has a lot that could be unpacked for educational purposes. So just focusing on the regions, because we knew that teachers are looking for information that relate to their part of the world. So we put together these learning assessments over a couple-month period through this crowdsourcing effort. And these are up on climate.gov, which you can find by going to climate.gov and going under teaching resource, teaching climate there, and you can also do a Google search and find this pretty easily. So each one of these, this is the chapter on the coasts, and there's a disclaimer that acknowledges that the work that we put together wasn't fully sanctioned as part of the National Climate Assessment. We're just trying to add value to it. But I would encourage you all to please take a look at this. There's the key messages that had already been pulled out for us, so that made our work in some ways much easier than it would be otherwise. This is the chapter on the ocean that Scott and others put together, and the ocean education community helped us in pulling some of the great videos together that are part of this. Videos, visualizations, and so forth. A lot of these resources are in the CLEAN collection that I mentioned earlier. And so just to unpack this a little bit more, this is one of the key messages on rising ocean temperatures. We put together guiding questions that a teacher might use in a classroom discussion, and then annotate the key figures and so forth. So I'd like to be able to say this has been a huge success. We've gotten unbelievable web traffic, and the reality is we haven't. And one of the reasons is that I think as a community we're good at the education piece. We kind of suck at the communications and outreach piece, to be blunt, to use a technical term. So all of you who are education and outreach efforts, please help us out. We could really use a bump in the traffic here. That number of page views is just 1,000. So we had a peak when the assessment came out, when we just had a handful of resources there, and then we had another peak in September. But in any event, there's a lot of great materials in here, and we need your help to make best use of these. Okay, I'm stalling out here. How do I? Okay, so More can be done to unpack. We've got 150,000 secondary science teachers in this country, 40,000 secondary schools, 40 million students graduate, or 40 million students in grades 6 to 16. I personally think that focusing on the secondary students is a really important leverage point, but the Climate Education and Literacy Initiative that just recently was announced by OSTP has essentially an all hands on deck, all the above approach in terms of education. So it's not just focusing on secondary science teachers as I would recommend, but I think wisely they say everybody needs to chip in and help out here. So the initiative, in case you missed this, it was announced a couple weeks ago, highlighted 25 of the hundreds of education projects out there. We were involved with some videos that got developed by the Department of Energy and AGI to unpack the energy literacy framework. NOAA's doing some professional development work with teachers that was acknowledged. The CLEAN project was highlighted, the Alliance for Climate Education. So the overall theme of this initiative was lifting America's game in climate education, training, and literacy. So I would like to suggest that this initiative could be a part of a national strategy that could tie in with the UN framework of climate change that we are signatories of, after all. And again, I would think that one of the low-hanging fruit is to focus on secondary schools, leverage the next generation science standards. We've tried to tie in the next generation science standards to the work of the learning pathways that we've put together. But in any event, any of you who are interested in learning more about climate education, there's a lot of climate literacy sessions here at AGU. We've got a workshop on Thursday afternoon where the community is going to get together and talk about next steps. Come by our booth at NCSE, which is going to be booth 2515. And if you're interested, stop by my session on Wednesday, which really focuses on how we can help counter climate confusion in the classroom. Thanks very much.